The Roman historian Suetonius wrote only one line about what he witnessed in Emperor Caligula's private chambers, then crossed it out with such violence that his stylus tore through the papyrus. For 70 years after Caligula's assassination, that single scratched-out sentence haunted him, not because of what he'd written, but because even those words were too tame to capture the truth. Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus ruled Rome for 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days. In that brief span, this 24-year-old emperor didn't just break the boundaries of Roman decency. He obliterated them so completely that his own Praetorian Guard, men who had sworn blood oaths to protect him, finally cornered him in a palace corridor and stabbed him 30 times. But their knives couldn't kill what Caligula had unleashed. The rituals he performed behind marble doors, the sacred laws he perverted, the family bonds he shattered. These acts carved themselves so deeply into Roman memory that senators would still wake screaming his name decades after his death. What drove a beloved young prince, heir to the greatest empire on earth, to transform his palace into a theatre of depravity so complete that his own grandmother begged the gods to strike him down? The answer lies not in madness, but in something far more terrifying: the absolute corruption of absolute power, and a mind brilliant enough to weaponize Rome's deepest taboos against itself. Gaius Caligula was never supposed to be emperor. Born the third son of Rome's most celebrated general, Germanicus, he spent his childhood in military camps along the Rhine frontier, where battle-hardened legionaries gave him his nickname, Little Boots, for the miniature soldier's sandals his mother dressed him in. The troops adored him. Here was a boy who could recite the names of fallen heroes, who listened wide-eyed to stories of Germanic battles, who seemed destined to carry on his father's noble legacy. But Rome's imperial palace was a place where destiny rotted like fruit left too long in the sun. When Germanicus died suddenly in Antioch, many whispered of poison. Young Caligula found himself thrust into the viper's nest of imperial politics. His great-uncle, Emperor Tiberius, summoned the 18-year-old to the island fortress of Capri, where the aging ruler had retreated with his collection of philosophical texts, astronomical instruments, and what the servants whispered about only in the darkest corners of the villa. For 6 years, Caligula lived in that island prison, watching Tiberius exercise power through fear and paranoia. The old emperor had grown to trust no one, not even his own shadow. Every morning brought new executions, new accusations of treason, new displays of the absolute authority that turned men into gods and gods into monsters. Caligula learned to smile through it all. The perfect student, the grateful heir, the young man who never flinched when Tiberius ordered another senator's death over breakfast. The Roman people knew none of this when Tiberius finally died in 37 AD. They saw only the golden boy returning to them, Germanicus' son, the child of the camps, the prince who would restore the glory that Tiberius had buried in paranoia and cruelty. When Caligula entered Rome for his coronation, 1 million voices rose in celebration. Flowers rained from every window. Veterans wept openly in the streets. They had no idea they were cheering for a man who had spent 6 years learning that human beings were nothing more than instruments to be played, broken, and discarded at will. The transformation began so subtly that even Caligula's closest advisors missed it. In his first months as emperor, he honoured his predecessors, freed political prisoners, and distributed generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard. Rome exhaled in relief. But behind the marble facade of imperial benevolence, something darker was taking root. It started with the dreams. Caligula began telling his inner circle about nightly visions where he conversed with Jupiter, Venus, and Diana as equals, not as a mortal seeking divine favour, but as one god speaking to another. His secretary Callistus noticed how the young emperor's eyes would glaze over during these recountings, his voice dropping to a whisper as he described intimate conversations with deities who revealed to him the true nature of power. By his second year as emperor, the dreams had become doctrine. Caligula declared himself a living god, but not content with mere titles. He began to act upon what he claimed the gods had revealed to him in those midnight conversations. Roman religion, he announced, was corrupted by false modesty. The gods, he explained to a horrified Senate, engaged in acts that mortals considered taboo because divine beings existed beyond human morality. As their equal, Caligula proclaimed, he too must transcend such earthly limitations. The first ritual occurred during the festival of Lupercalia in 39 AD. What had been Rome's ancient fertility celebration became something entirely different under Caligula's direction. In the underground chambers beneath the palace, he gathered his most trusted followers, senators, generals, and wealthy merchants who dared not refuse an imperial invitation. There, surrounded by flickering oil lamps and clouds of burning frankincense, Caligula performed ceremonies that inverted every sacred Roman tradition. Where Roman priests maintained strict celibacy during religious rites, Caligula demanded sexual congress. Where traditional rituals separated the sacred from the profane, he deliberately merged them. Most shocking of all, where Roman law held certain family bonds as inviolate, the relationship between brother and sister, the respect owed to one's parents, Caligula declared these restrictions meaningless for those who had achieved divine status. His sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Livilla, were not merely present at these ceremonies. According to the trembling testimony of survivors, they were central to them. Caligula proclaimed that since Egyptian pharaohs maintained divine blood through sibling marriage, and since the gods themselves knew no such human restrictions, his own divinity demanded similar expressions. The rites that followed, performed before audiences who dared not look away, shattered boundaries that had stood firm for 8 centuries of Roman civilization. But even these transgressions paled beside what came next. Caligula began selecting prominent Romans, senators with beautiful wives, generals with teenage daughters, and commanding them to participate in rituals that reduced them to mere instruments of his divine will. Refusal meant death, but participation meant something worse: the complete destruction of everything they had believed about honour, dignity, and the natural order of the world. The breaking point came during the feast of Saturnalia in December of 40 AD. What should have been Rome's most joyous celebration, a time when social hierarchies temporarily dissolved and masters served their slaves, became instead a week-long orgy of ritualized degradation that left even Caligula's most hardened supporters questioning their emperor's sanity. In the great hall of the palace, beneath frescoes depicting the noble deeds of Augustus and Tiberius, Caligula orchestrated scenes that would have made barbarians weep. He forced consul Valerius Asiaticus to watch as his wife was made to perform acts that Roman law classified as crimes against nature. He commanded the elderly senator Junius Silanus to participate in rituals with his own granddaughter, while the emperor, dressed in the costume of Venus, presided over ceremonies that transformed Rome's most sacred chamber into what witnesses could only describe as a theatre of divine madness. But it was his treatment of Drusilla, his beloved sister, his claimed divine consort, that finally pushed his inner circle beyond endurance. When Drusilla died suddenly in 38 AD, possibly from the physical toll of her brother's divine requirements, Caligula's grief transformed into something even more terrifying than his lust had been. He declared her a goddess, built temples in her honour, and commanded that Romans worship her as they would Diana or Minerva. More disturbing still, he began conducting elaborate rituals in which he claimed to commune with her spirit, ceremonies that required participants to engage in acts with her preserved remains that violated every law of both gods and men. The Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers who had sworn to protect the emperor with their lives, began meeting in secret. Their commander, Cassius Chaerea, a grizzled veteran who had served under 3 emperors, could no longer reconcile his oath of loyalty with what he witnessed nightly in the palace. The man he was sworn to protect had become something that no longer deserved the name of emperor, or even human. The conspiracy that formed around Chaerea included senators, freedmen, and even members of Caligula's own household staff. They were united not by political ambition, but by a shared revulsion that had grown too heavy to bear. The rituals had to end, even if it meant shedding imperial blood. On January 24th, 41 AD, as Caligula returned from a private ceremony in honour of Drusilla, the conspirators struck. In a narrow corridor beneath the palace, the same underground chambers where he had performed his most degrading rites, they surrounded him. Chaerea's blade found his chest first, but 29 other wounds followed. Each conspirator needed to feel the emperor's blood on his hands, as if only direct participation in his death could cleanse them of what they had witnessed. The assassination was swift. But the aftermath revealed the true scope of Caligula's corruption. When the conspirators searched his private chambers, they found detailed records, written in the emperor's own hand, documenting every ritual, every participant, every degradation he had orchestrated. More chilling still were the plans for future ceremonies, rites that would have extended his divine requirements to every prominent family in Rome. The new emperor, Claudius, ordered most of these records burned, but fragments survived in the private collections of historians and the nightmares of witnesses who could never forget. The official historians wrote that Caligula died mad. It was easier that way. Madness could be contained, explained, dismissed as the tragic consequence of absolute power corrupting an unstable mind. But those who lived through his reign, who witnessed the methodical precision with which he orchestrated each degradation, knew a more terrifying truth. Gaius Caligula was never insane. He was something far more dangerous, a brilliant man who had discovered that shame was the most powerful weapon ever forged. In the months following his assassination, as Rome struggled to rebuild its shattered dignity, a pattern emerged from the testimonies of survivors. Every ritual, every perversion, every violation had served a purpose beyond mere gratification. Caligula had weaponized Roman virtue against itself, using the empire's deepest taboos to create a form of control more absolute than any army could provide. Those who participated in his ceremonies were bound to him not by loyalty, but by shared complicity in acts so shameful that exposure would destroy them as surely as his daggers could. The senators who had knelt before him in divine worship could never again speak of Roman honour without hearing the echo of their own degradation. The generals who had offered their wives and daughters to his rituals could never again command respect without remembering their submission. Most chilling of all, the common citizens who had cheered his public displays, believing they witnessed religious ceremony rather than calculated humiliation, had become unknowing participants in their own moral destruction. Claudius ordered the palace chambers scoured with holy water and blessed by every priest in Rome, but the stains Caligula left behind proved impossible to cleanse. His innovations in depravity became whispered legends that spread throughout the empire, carried by traumatized witnesses who could never quite forget what they had seen. Future emperors, Nero, Commodus, Caracalla, would draw inspiration from fragments of Caligula's methods, though none would match the systematic precision with which he had corrupted an entire civilization. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that emerged in the years following his death. Caligula's rituals had worked. The Rome he left behind was fundamentally changed, more compliant, more fearful, more willing to accept that some powers existed beyond the reach of law or conscience. The Republic's ancient virtues, already weakened by generations of imperial rule, had been deliberately and methodically poisoned by a young man who understood that the fastest way to destroy a civilization was not through conquest, but through the corruption of its deepest beliefs about itself. 2,000 years later, historians still struggle to comprehend the full scope of what Caligula unleashed in those perfumed chambers. His reign lasted less than 4 years, but the questions it raised about power, corruption, and the fragility of moral order continue to haunt us. For in the end, Caligula proved something that no civilization wants to acknowledge, that the distance between order and chaos, between virtue and depravity, between the sacred and the profane, is measured not in miles or years, but in a single moment when someone with absolute power decides that boundaries no longer apply to them. The boy who once wore little boots in Germanic camps had become the emperor who taught Rome that shame, not fear, was the ultimate instrument of control. And in those underground chambers where marble statues of gods looked down upon acts that would make demons weep, Gaius Caligula discovered a truth that died with him, but never truly disappeared. That the most effective way to rule human beings is first to make them forget what it means to be human. The whispers from those marble corridors fell silent nearly 2 millennia ago, but the questions Caligula raised about absolute power and moral corruption echo still through every palace, every parliament, every place where human beings convince themselves that their authority places them beyond the reach of ordinary decency. Perhaps that is his most lasting legacy. Not the depravity itself, but the reminder that civilization is always just one corrupted conscience away from discovering what monsters look like when they wear crowns.